This is a 1974 MGB GT and it is the archetypal classic British sports car. 500,000 rolled off the Abingdon production lines, making it the most successful sports car of its era. It was a huge hit in both Europe and North America thanks not only to its good looks, but also its simplicity, its value for money, and also, most importantly, fun. Developed in the late 50s, the MGB wasn't a trailblazer in terms of technology. It was all very simple and well proven. Its predecessor, the MGA, was a good car, but many felt it was too harsh, so civility was the focus of the engineers. In that respect, it was a worthy improvement. The structure of the car was all new, and for the first time on an MG, it was a monocoque. The B was also much more practical, making much better use of its space, even if it was about 3 inches shorter than the MGA. That's where the new stuff ends, as the rest is pretty conventional. The front end rides on coil springs with rack and pinion steering and disc brakes to get it to stop. To get it to go is BMC's faithful old B-series engine, 4 cylinders, overhead valves, twin SU carburetors and enlarged to 1.8 litres, throwing out about 95 horsepower and 110 pound-feet of torque. At the back, a simple live axle resting on leaf springs with drum brakes. The springing was significantly softer than the MGA, but a combination of good engineering and the stiffer monocoque meant it still drove well, and the bigger engine provided the grunt to make it noticeably quicker. The MGB was launched in 1962. It wasn't massively modern, but that was okay because it tapped into exactly what people wanted. Motor Magazine hit the nail on the head, remarking about its grand touring ability. A fine example that this MG had a feature no sports car before it had. It was practical enough and refined enough to be an only car, and that is part of what enabled its success. The price also reflected MG's intentions. Not including tax, an MGB would have set you back £690, while a Sunbeam Alpine would have cost you a fiver more. Triumph were offering a TR4 for a whopping 750 quid. For a few years, the MGB was only available as a roadster, but in 1965, Pininfarina got involved, and born was one of the best looking coupes of all time, the MGB GT. This took an already very practical soft top and turned it into the poor man's Aston Martin, allowing the marketing people to really double down on its grand touring ability. Brochures sold you a lifestyle, an experience, a very different market to its little brother, the MG Midget, pictured here in a pit garage. To me though, the styling is the main attraction. Just take a look at it. Every line is crisp, simple, and the silhouette is just perfect. Ask anybody to draw a sports coupe and this is what they come up with. Low, long bonnet, sloping rear end, and all those touches that make it a design classic and a 60s icon. Personality-filled round headlamps, chrome bumpers, clean lines, little fins at the back, and most importantly, wire wheels. It has aged beautifully and the proportions are spot on. The original shape was penned in-house by Don Hayter, and Pininfarina's GT only enhanced what was already there. We'll go into how the MGB was facelifted in a bit, but for now let's take a look at this 1974 example. The colour is citron yellow, a British Leyland shade that is so very 70s, and it goes very well with this black honeycomb grille down here. In my view, the GT is a much more elegant shape than the Roadster, and the wire wheels on this example are a sight to behold. The B manages to look purposeful without being aggressive. The interior of the MGB also faced a number of changes through its life, including the addition of centre vents and a fully padded dashboard. Much like a very late Mini, the size of the instruments annoyingly throws the centre vents out of alignment with the centre console, but that's the nature of mucking about with an existing design. The seats are trimmed in simple black velour, and though they may seem plain, they offset the wacky exterior hue. This particular MGB GT treads the line between the practicality and good looks of the GT with the open-top nature of the Roadster by way of a Webasto roof, a must in my opinion. We have to take one big thing into consideration here. The MGB was a huge step up from the MGA in terms of usability. For starters, the MGB got locking doors, a locking boot, and wind-up windows, all features that were lacking on the old car. The switch to a monocoque also made a huge difference to practicality. Despite being slightly smaller than an MG8, there is much more room inside. Not having the chassis underneath you means the seats are mounted lower and there's a lot more legroom. That isn't to say it's spacious, because it isn't, but it's much more usable as a daily car. Unlike the MG8, you can actually carry things with you and not break your back on a long journey. The MGB acts as the mould for all sports cars that followed it. Unlike its predecessor, it managed to be both enthusing to drive and retaining the practicality of a small saloon. In the GT's case, it even had rear seats. By anybody's measure, those are not seats. At least, not if you have arms or legs anyway. Underneath this bench lies the battery, of course, for better weight distribution. Behind that rear bench is the load space. It's by no means massive, but it's more than big enough for a 55-year-old design that was on the bijou side when it was new. Owing to the fastback nature of the GT, you get into that load space through a hatchback, something of a novelty for 1965. It seemed to all be going so well. Here was a truly marvellous looking car that was great to drive, reliable and practical. It ticked all the boxes for so many people, especially the Americans, who picked up 2/3 of all MGs in this period. Unfortunately though, in true British Leyland fashion, it all very quickly started to fall apart. There were attempts to improve the concept over its life, but many of these were failures. First was the MGC from 1967. This car had a 3-litre straight 6 under the bonnet. All very well, you may say, but the engine's characteristics really didn't suit a sports car, and the big old lump made the dinky little MG very front heavy. It only lasted for 2 years, but the regular MGB did receive a few mechanical upgrades. It got a new gearbox, a new rear axle and a front anti-roll bar as standard. Newer competitors were coming onto the scene and ever-tightening emissions regulations were hampering performance. In the US, things got really bad. They had different carburettors and only about 70 horsepower. Compared to cars like the Nissan S30, this was pitiful. Abingdon did have an answer though. British Leyland made a lot of engines, and probably the best of the bunch was the Rover V8. So the correct solution all along was to put that engine under this bonnet. The lightweight all-alloy 3.5 litre unit was available in the States in the Rover P6, but for some reason it was never available in this chassis. The reality was that this seemingly brilliant idea had crashed head-on into the oil crisis. As I said last month, everything motoring related in this era comes straight back to the oil crisis. The MGB didn't get the engine it deserved and slowly withered away as it didn't get the development needed to keep up with the pace. But that isn't to say things stood completely still. It got the few mechanical improvements I mentioned before and a few facelifts. The first of these was in 1969 when the chrome slatted grille was replaced with a recessed black plastic grille. The public reaction though wasn't brilliant, and their solution can be seen on this car. Put mildly, it was to bring back the old grille but replace the chrome slats with some black mesh. This is the best grille in my opinion, but it too didn't last very long as US regulation struck again. In September 1974, just a few months after this car was built, the MGB was fitted with large black bumpers, meant to withstand a 5-mile-an-hour impact. The car was also raised by 1 inch because the headlamps were too low. For a lot of people, this ruined the MGB. But it did become more compliant, and a lot of people now look at the rubber bumper models as the ones they remember from their childhood. Following this, they fitted a rear anti-roll bar and fiddled with the geometry to try and compensate for the increased ride height. But it was a losing battle. All this might make you think that the MGB slowly sunk into irrelevance during its own lifetime, but no. The best year for production was 1977. Despite its big plastic bumpers and increased ride height, people kept buying them. It had become the standard for a sports car and almost a classic within its own lifetime. Magazines began using very particular language about it. Car said it had a certain charm about it, and Motor called it an old friend. It's not as if they didn't try to replace it though. There were a number of false starts and missed opportunities, but there's one that I want to talk about in particular. In 1969 there was a car kicking around known as the ADO-21, with a mid-engine rear-drive layout, hydroelastic suspension and a Dion rear end. It was a fabulous thing and it looked like a cross between a Dino 206 and a Ferrari 308. ADO-21 would have replaced both the MG Midget and the MGB. But as ever, British Leyland happened. There was no money available and the MGB was still selling well enough for BL to just kick the can down the road a bit. We also have to realise the internal political situation at British Leyland. Within the empire were two sports car manufacturers, MG and Triumph, and they were both competing for resources. Rationalisation was the order of the day, and Triumph realised that the US market liked simplicity. The conventionally engineered Triumph TR7 was launched in 1975. The MGB then was left to wither on the vine, and it survived alongside its little brother until October 1980, when the MG plant at Abingdon was finally closed. By the early 90s though, Mazda had the MX-5 and suddenly people realised that the sports car wasn't dead. Austin Rover had shown the MG EXE prototype in the mid-80s, but it was never taken seriously by the management. Rover were left behind when the MX-5 was launched and they scrambled to bring out something at least. Their answer was simply to bring back the MGB. A 30-year-old car was back on sale as the MG R V8. It was only a stopgap before the MGF became available, but you could still buy a brand new MGB in 1995. That's how enduring this car was, and still is. Even today there are resto mod MGBs that you can go out and buy almost off the shelf. This car looked hopelessly outclassed even in the late 70s, but two whole generations of car enthusiasts lived in the shadow of the MGB. Some absolutely loved them and still do today. That's why there's such a massive following for them with people of all ages. Some found them a bit outclassed and a bit ordinary. There was nothing that desirable about an MGB, and that's the price you pay for success and longevity. It became very normal to a lot of people. That's why a lot of people do still shrug at the mention of this car. What everyone can agree on though is how utterly gorgeous it is. For now, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'll have more videos coming along soon.